for those, I know several of you, for those who I don't know, I worked for a state agency for 20 years, 2 different state agencies, 15 of them were in Arkansas prior to taking this job, and I started this role in June, so relatively new in this role. And when I worked for Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, I was on the steering committee for the Reservoir Fish Habitat Partnership. So one of the other 19 partnerships that are part of NFHAP, in addition to Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture. So I have had some experience with NFHAP, or with a fish habitat partnership at the partnership level before taking this job. And before I move on, I wanted to acknowledge Ryan Roberts, who's my counterpart with AFWA, and Will Duncan. I didn't think Will was coming, but Will's our regional NFHAP coordinator for Region 5.
I'll just turn up anywhere.
Well, I'll invite both of you to correct me on anything I mess up on here. But what I'm going to do first is break the #1 rule of public speaking and read directly off of my slides, if I can.
Oh, we're not sure if that works.
It doesn't seem to be.
I think you even tricked you to read off.
Yeah.
It didn't connect, sorry.
Okay.
Barb is gonna help.
Okay.
No, it's not working.
This is good. I'm gonna have a hard time reading. Okay, before I start reading, I forgot I put this in here. This is the map of where the 20 partnerships are. We're working on a new map that better highlights some parts of this, but you can see NFHAP is a nationwide program. It covers every part of the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii. We have 4 partnerships in Alaska even, but Alaska has 40% of the water in the United States, so it should have a lot of partnerships up there. But anyway, that's those are the 20 partnerships we have now. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the ACE Act, which is the legislation that was passed in 2020 that codified NFHAP. So NFHAP was a program, it was essentially a program of the Fish and Wildlife Service that had its own board, but the funding and the administration and everything went through the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then in 2020, along with several other pieces, the Chesapeake Bay program, NACA, and several other things were bundled together in this America's Conservation Enhancement Act, or the ACE Act. And so I want to talk about what was laid out in that act as the purpose of NFHAP. And then we'll talk to you about a couple of specific things that are current things going on at the national level, the interagency operational plan, and the assessment, the national assessment that's coming up, and then talk about a few challenges that have come along with the passage of the ACE Act at the end. Next slide, please. All right, this is the part I was talking about. I'm going to read because I don't have this legislation memorized. This is verbatim from the congressional legislation that codified NFHAP by Congress. And so it's to achieve, the purpose of NFHAP is to achieve measurable habitat conservation results through strategic actions of fish habitat partnerships, such as Eastern Brook Trout Joint Venture, that lead to better fish habitat conditions and increased fishing opportunities by improving ecological conditions, restoring natural processes, or preventing the decline of intact and healthy systems. Next slide. Ooh, that didn't translate well. To establish number 2 purpose is to establish a consensus set of national conservation strategies as a framework to guide future actions and investments by fish habitat partnerships. Number 3, to broaden the community of support for fish habitat conservation by increasing fishing opportunities, fostering the participation of local communities in conservation activities, raising public awareness of the role healthy fish habitat plays in the quality of life and economic well-being of local communities. Next slide. Number 4, to fill gaps in the National Fish Habitat Assessment and the associated database of the National Fish Habitat Assessment, which will empower strategic conservation actions supported by broadly available scientific information and to integrate socioeconomic data in the analysis to improve the lives of humans in a manner consistent with fish habitat conservation goals. And one more, to communicate to the public and conservation partners the conservation outcomes produced collectively by the fish habitat partnerships and new opportunities and voluntary approaches for conserving fish habitat. So I read that because I think it's important for each of the fish habitat partnerships to kind of understand the broader context of NFHAP, and that what you're doing as a fish habitat partnership is feeding into this national effort and collectively trying to accomplish these things. So next slide, please. So these next two things are two items that are specifically called out in the legislation, but that are related to things that have been done by the NFHAP enterprise since its very beginning in the early 2000s. So I'm going to talk about the interagency operational plan first. So next slide, please. So the interagency operational plan is mandated by the ACE Act, and it is to ensure that all federal agencies that touch fish habitat are communicating and collaborating on fish habitat conservation. Also, the biggest part of it to me when this is developed is my vision for this is that it will be essentially a catalog of all federal resources that exist and are available for fish habitat work across the country. Specifically, it's called out in the legislation to be for the fish habitat partnerships, but it's going to be a lot of work to put this together. So I thought it would be best to make it for, regardless of whether it's a fish habitat partnership, if it's a state agency, if it's whoever it is that wants to do a fish habitat project, fish habitat conservation project, this will be a catalog of all the federal agency resources that may exist, and contacts for each of those resources that may exist that could be leveraged by a fish habitat partnership or someone else to do fish habitat work. And lastly, the legislation mandates that we compile and document the existence of any MOUs that exist between agencies that relate to fish habitat work. And I'll give you an example. A recent example of that is the Fish and Wildlife Service, BLM, Forest Service, I think are the three, recently, back in the spring, entered into a new MOU due to the fish passage, BIL fish passage effort, that they would collaborate on federally owned lands. There would be collaboration for improving fish passage. And there's various MOUs like that out there that exist. And so, but people, how would you know about it if you are a state or local government, or so it's not, there's no, billboards on the interstate about these MOUs. And so this will be a place where that'll be collected and put in one place. So next slide, please. So I said this effort goes back to the very beginning of NFHAP, and back in 2005, probably earlier than that, there was a federal caucus that was formed by NFHAP. Had representatives. I don't know how well, you probably can't see that very well, the list of federal agencies there on the left. Each agency committed various resources in support of the fish habitat partnerships. And I'll read it to you across the top: leadership, funding, data sharing, database development, education, recruiting potential partners, assistance with monitoring and evaluation, strategic planning, technical expertise, and allowing projects or facilitating projects on federal lands. And so this federal caucus met for probably 10 years on a regular basis to kind of put plans in place and just communicate and collaborate about fish habitat work going on across the country. And then in around 2015 or so, it died. And this particular graphic here is in the 2006 and 2012 action plans that you can get on the NFHAP website. But this is kind of what we're trying to resurrect through the IOP, is this collaboration between all these federal agencies, and not just the ones up there, but some additional ones. Next slide, please. Yeah. So according to the Act, this IOP is required to be completed by October of 2021. Oops. Hopefully it'll be completed by October 2024. So that's, but I was told, shortly after my hire that was to be one of my top priorities and it is. So we're gonna try to get that knocked out. But the other agencies that must be involved according to legislation are NOAA, USGS, Forest Service, and EPA. But as you saw from that previous slide, there's a whole lot more federal agencies that need to be involved and will be involved. And I want to say, Mark said something at lunch that resonated with me because it's exactly what this is about. Is a lot of times it's not always getting a federal agency to commit money for a NFHAP project. It's about getting a federal agency to do something they're already doing anyway, spending money they're already spending anyway, but help them see a way to make that benefit brook trout. For example, with lunch with the brook trout. How do we get NRCS doing farm bill programs that they're already going to do, they're already authorized to do? We're not asking them to find more money and divert it over to NFHAP, but how do we leverage what they're already doing to benefit brook trout or to benefit Pacific lamprey or whatever the case may be? And that's what this IOP is to be all about, is to help the agencies do what they're already doing, leverage the resources they already have, and make that available to all of you, and that you'll have this resource where you can see what's out there. So next slide, please. So this is the timeline. Like I said, my goal is to get this completed by next October. We've got a core team formed, and which is the agencies that I mentioned. We'll be engaging the larger team shortly after the first of the year, Bureau of Reclamation, Corps of Engineers, people like that. And then try to get board approval next summer and or board review next summer, and then hopefully get wrapped up by this time next year. Next slide, please. So that'll be the IOP. Will be hopefully it'll be an online kind of evergreen resource that is continually updated and has contacts associated with the various federal programs. So you don't just know that the program exists, but you also know who to talk to about that particular program. All right, so the national assessment, this is something that the last assessment was done in 2015. And so it's been a while, and going to be a new one. The new one is going to be completed in 2025. And a lot of the FHPs have asked, what's going to be asked of us? And what are we going to get out of it? And the next slide, please. I don't want to get ahead of my slides. But first off, the Science and Data Committee of NFHAP, which there may be some of you in here that are on that, I don't know, but they proposed 3 options for how to do this 2025 assessment. One is to just redo the 2015 assessment, but adding grazing, timber harvest, and socioeconomic data. The socioeconomic data is specifically called out in the legislation. It has to be added. But the Science and Data Committee decided they also wanted to add grazing and timber harvest to this assessment. And then option number 2 is to do that again, but the last time it was done, it did not include lakes, reservoirs, and some of the marine habitats. So, or is the board willing to spend the extra money it would take to incorporate those habitats? That's option 2. And then option 3 would be that, plus adding a climate resiliency component and in getting some preliminary discussions with various researchers. That's going to be an extremely expensive option relative to the other 2 if they incorporate the climate resiliency. So if anybody knows any pots of money laying around out there for that kind of thing, let me know, and I'll pass that along to the Science and Data Committee because we're trying to scrape together the money to see what we're going to be able to afford to do in this assessment. But the assessment has to be done, and at minimum, it will repeat the 2015 assessment, which is still online. You can still go and get that. So next slide, please. So what will be asked of you, your Science and Data Committee may be asked to help them locate databases, essentially. Nothing that you're going to be asked to create that's not already in existence, but they may need some help, from your assessments, or, probably more likely is helping, at least certainly from, states and NGOs both, and federal agencies, helping them locate databases that already exist. And one that I thought about, if they're doing timber harvest, I know in my state, the State Forestry Commission maintains a database like that. And certainly our Science and NFHAP Science and Data Committee wouldn't know how to get a hold of the Arkansas Forestry Commission's timber harvest data. So would be asked to give them connect them with someone. So some of you somebody may reach out and ask you about contributing, just helping them locate contacts for that. So next slide, please. The primary audience is board. The assessment is also going to highlight for policymakers the greatest needs, and that's going to help with the reauthorization effort and getting more money, which I'm going to talk about in a second. I got 3 minutes left. So, how's this going to help you? Hopefully, the spatial data sets that come out of this assessment will be something that each of you will be able to use in your own jobs. So next slide, please. Last thing, current challenges with NFHAP, particularly related to the ACE Act. My understanding from talking to the policy folks that work on the Hill is it's not unusual for a piece of legislation to have some speed bumps and things and unanticipated consequences of some of the verbiage. And one of the ones with the ACE Act is the project timing, as some of you have had to deal with, where you send in your proposal for a project, but the funding's not available for like 18 months later. And that has to do with just like two words in the act that weren't even intended to do that. But there's some words say in next fiscal year instead of not even saying anything. Anyway, it calls it to have to overlap 2 fiscal years unnecessary, and it doesn't accomplish anything. But that's the way the attorneys say you have to do it because those words are in the act. So that's a challenge that we hope to get fixed in the reauthorization in 2025. The one-to-one match requirement certainly is a challenge when it comes to coordination. It is a challenge with project as well, as you well know, finding a one-to-one match, particularly when people can go out there and get BIL funds or some other funding source that doesn't require that level of match. But when you talk about the money that goes to the joint venture for Lori for coordination, a lot of the partnerships are struggling to come up with that match. And so that's a challenge that's going to have to be dealt with in the reauthorization as well. And I think it's going to be a situation between now and then of asking for forgiveness from the congressional committees because it's just not happening. So finally, last thing, grant administration. Like I said, historically, NFHAP was a Fish and Wildlife Service program. Fish and Wildlife Service employees administered the grants. That's still the case. We're in this interim season. Part of the legislation, it's no longer a Fish and Wildlife Service program, but the funding still comes through the service budget. So ideally, the service will be able to just pass it through to some other entity. If NFHAP was stood up as its own entity that could manage grants, they would get the entire pot of money, and then there could be some process by which the grants are distributed to the project partners. Whereas right now, the grants come from the Fish and Wildlife Service to the project partner. So you have to deal with ASAP and grant solutions and all that fun stuff. And I'm sure some of you have dealt with local partners that are low capacity entities a lot of times that they don't deal well with ASAP and SAM and grant solutions. And it ends up putting a lot more work on you and a lot more work on people like Will having to deal with this kind of stuff. So we're trying to figure out what the long-term solution is there for how the funds are, if we can move the funds out in bigger chunks, because the fish habitat partnerships themselves don't have capacity to administer grants. NFHAP doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the ability to do it. So what does that look like? So trying to figure that out, that'll be something that's subject to change in the future, and hopefully, well, not hopefully, but if it does change, it's going to make it a lot easier on our partners to get the money, put the money on the ground to get the work done. And the other thing is we need more money. So the the amount of funding hasn't changed and not significantly. And now you went from 5 partnerships in the original NFHAP, now you got 20. So the same size pie, but it's got to be sliced up into a lot more pieces. So next slide, please. That's it. That's all I got. Went a little over.
Okay. So we don't actually have time to address questions right now because we need to move on to the next piece. If you have questions for Jason, track him down here in the room. If you're on Zoom and you have questions for Jason, please post them in the chat and we'll make sure that they get into your hands. Jason, thank you very much. Sorry the remote didn't work for you.